Interactions Food Security and Agriculture Working Group works to promote a future of vibrant, just, resilient communities free from hunger and poverty that contribute to the food security and nutrition of their countries. So why, you may say, is gender important to agriculture, food, and nutrition security? Gender discrimination reduces farm yields, which increase food and nutrition insecurity. Gender inequality prevents female smallholder farmers from equal access to productive resources. And I'm sure we all know by now, those of us who are following these issues, that according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, if women farmers had the same access to productive resources as men, they could increase their farm yields by 20 to 30%. This in turn could help lift an additional 100 to 150 million people around the globe out of hunger and poverty. The contributions female smallholder farmers can make to food and nutrition security cannot be overlooked, particularly at a time when on any given day there is only a 90-day supply of food in the world. Clearly, investing in female smallholder farmers and providing them with the resources they need to increase their agricultural productivity is a smart strategy in the drive to improve global food and nutrition security. This is why Women Thrive is very pleased that a key piece of legislation on food security, the Global Food Security Act, was recently reintroduced in the House of Representatives by Representative Chris Smith and Representative Betty McCollum. We expect the Senate will reintroduce its version of the bill any day now, possibly today, and that will be sponsored by Senators Robert Casey and John Isaacson. The Global Food Security Act would permanently authorize Feed the Future Food Security Initiative, which currently operates in 19 countries around the globe. Feed the Future has had some positive impacts for female smallholder farmers. The 2014 Feed the Future Progress Report reports an increase in the ratio of female smallholder farmers receiving U.S. government assistance to access agricultural loans. Additionally, the male-to-female ratio of farms using improved technology or management practices as a result of U.S. government assistance is also improved. The Global Food Security Act also has strong language on the key role of female smallholder farmers and the role that they play in ensuring food and nutrition security, and it also requires gender analysis of food security programming. So we thank, the sponsors and all of the co-sponsors, and we hope that this piece of legislation will be enacted into law in Congress, in this Congress. At today's panel, we will hear from a variety of experts on gender and agriculture who will brief us on the latest evidence and lessons. I'll introduce them briefly. You all have their bios in your materials. Our first speaker is Dr. Catherine Fritz, and she's the director. Actually, I think what I have is incorrect. She is the director, it says Global Health and Research and Interim Director of Gender, Economic Empowerment and Livelihoods Portfolio at the International Center for Research on Women, one of my favorite organizations. And Catherine will give us the big picture through an overview of gender, food security, and women. Our second panelist, to my left, is Michael O'Sullivan, and he's an economist and land thematic leader at the World Bank. Mike will discuss a report issued by the World Bank on the One campaign called Leveling the Field, Improving Opportunities for African Women Farmers, and I think there's some copies of that are floating around. Michael will share the report findings and some recommendations. And our final panelist, who tells everyone, and it's true that she's my favorite intern, is Sylvia Cabas, and she is the gender advisor at the Bureau of Food Security at USAID. Her remarks will focus on Feed the Future and the Women's Empowerment Agriculture Index. Each of the presenters are going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will then take questions from you and have a discussion for about another 10 or 15 minutes, and particularly because Catherine is going to have to leave a little bit early, so we've decided to structure it that way. So after each presentation, then we'll have some questions, and then at the end, we'll also have more time for dialogue. So I want to thank you for being here, and we're really looking forward to a lively discussion. So over to you,
Great.
Catherine.
Thank you. I'm just going to stand up so I can see you and you can see me. Again, I work for the International Center for Research on Women, and I'm actually representing my colleague, Aslihan Kes, who couldn't be here. She's actually in Dakar right now, but she developed this presentation. I'm going to do it for her. As you mentioned, Pat, my home base is global health. But one of the really nice things about working at an applied research institute that has a population focus of women and girls is that all of these development issues come together. And obviously there are, obvious connections between health and food security. So, and being a gender expert, it's quite easy to kind of move around, and very interesting to move around all of these different topics, and have the opportunity to talk to you today about agriculture and food security. But just a little bit of the overview, and I'm sure all of you are kind of aware of the global trends in food security and undernourishment. But like many global development indicators, we've been seeing a lot of great progress globally on undernourishment. There's good news. The prevalence is declining overall. But as with most development issues, those global figures mask some really troubling regional variations, just as we see with maternal mortality, for example, and that we've seen those rates drop very precipitously over the past 10 or 15 years. And yet in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, there's still really egregious amounts of maternal mortality. It's the same with undernourishment. So especially in sub-Saharan Africa, more than 1 in 4 people is undernourished, and in Southern Asia, despite a lot of progress over the last 20 years, is still a very concerning amount of undernourishment. So the issue remains top of the development agenda, as you said, and of course the way that it intersects with gender inequality is what we want to examine today. Basically, we want to talk about women as being critical within all 3 pillars of food security. And those 3 pillars being food availability, food access, and food utilization. Of course, we know that women cultivate a great number of crops, many times for consumption, but they are active as well in growing crops for income and in cash crop production. They invest really heavily and prioritize spending on food and children's needs. And of course, they're responsible for food selection and preparation at the household level. So these are just the broad ways in which women are critical. I think the area of food, women farmers as being central to food production is the area that we've got the most evidence around, or that the argument is the most robust, because we really have come to understand in the last 20 years that women farmers are absolutely critical to food production. No one questions that at all. And of course, we know that in many countries around the world, certainly in the developing world, agriculture is the most important sector for women. It is the primary livelihood for women globally. They comprise 43% of the agricultural labor force in developing countries, from 20% to 50% in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. And many of these women are smallholder farmers. And what we see, generally speaking, is that while men predominate in the growing of cash crops and field crops, women are usually responsible for more family sustenance in terms of their food production. But they are also market-oriented from time to time. One of the things we're going to be talking a lot about today is the lost potential for food security, and this comes up really nicely in this report, Mike, I think you brought from the World Bank, right, that you all have, which is really this huge gender gap in productivity in agriculture. And there's a growing amount of evidence and data really drilling down onto what's causing this gender gap and what are its ramifications. But these are just a few high points. In Burkina Faso, the productivity difference between men and women in control plots was 18%. Also in Kenya, there's a lot of modeling that helps to show, for example, that if women had the same access to productive inputs as men, that yield could increase by as much as 22%. And as Pat indicated, also the FAO statistic about how many more millions of people could be fed globally were women more integrated into economic agricultural systems. The question is what drives the gender productivity gap, and of course it's all the various things that we know about that drive discrepancies in women's access, in women's productivity globally, not just in agriculture, but also in formal employment and other economic livelihoods. So women don't have the same access to resources, training, market access, and opportunities. So in agriculture, we're talking about land, fertilizers, seeds, mechanical equipment, credit, education, of course, extension services, and output markets. But very importantly, underlying all of this lack of access are social norms and institutional barriers that women that underlie and magnify these inequalities, further widening the gender gap. One of the things I wanted to focus a little bit on today is the gender gap in land ownership, because this is something that ICRW does a lot of research on. So I just thought I would dig a little bit deeper on this topic. You know, people are often perplexed and challenged and overwhelmed by land tenure systems. There are formal policies and laws that dictate how land is inherited and distributed, who can have title and who can't. And there's also customary laws, which are often fly in the face of the formal laws. All of this is a very large system that is hard to know where you can intersect to change. But we do know that it's a huge barrier. So we've done research in South Africa and Uganda, specifically doing population-based surveys where we looked specifically at, and by the way, it's hard to get data on this topic as well. There are very few studies that have collected really micro-level data on land ownership, and it can be tricky data to ask people about as well. But we did the study in South Africa and Uganda where we found 17% of women reported owning land in South Africa on their own. The same in Uganda. Slightly larger percent in Uganda owned land with others. And we know from other studies in South Asia, for example, that roughly 10 to 15% of total land is owned by women. By the way, in South Africa and Uganda, this compares. In South Africa, for example, 17% of women reported owning land, while 53% of men own land. And in Uganda, 17% of women versus 45% of men owning land. In Karnataka as well, a household survey found that 14% of household land is owned by women, while 71% is owned by men. So that's part of the huge gender gap right there, is just who owns what. But who owns what doesn't tell us enough. What we also see in this research is that male-headed households also own more land. So in male-headed households, you have larger farms, more productivity than in female-headed households. One interesting thing that also came out of the research that we did in South Africa and Uganda on land ownership as well was that property rights were strong, or women's ownership of property was also stronger in households that were female-headed, but where the man was So in cases where women are heads of households, they are able to own land, to acquire land, and to use it productively. But there's almost an inverse relationship between the extent that a man is present in the household and the extent to which women actually are able to exercise their land rights, which really drills down on the fact that it's also household power dynamics between men and women that are at play. So you have these structural issues around policies and laws, you have a lot of household issues around customary labor divisions and allocations between men and women. One of the other things that the research shows is that insecure land rights really disincentivizes long-term planning and investment. This is a huge issue. So and this is for both men and women, but in studies in Ghana and Uganda show that when women found their land rights insecure, they actually avoid allowing fields to lay fallow, for example, because if they feel if they're not using it, someone could take it away. This, of course, could be an issue for men as well, but since women own so much less land, it is even more so for women. And in Ethiopia, researchers found that when households had fully secure and transferable rights, they were almost 60 times more likely to engage in land terracing, which of course is the best practice in agriculture and requires investment and inputs. And people just aren't going to make those inputs and those investments when their land rights are insecure. And we also know that inadequate land rights constrains women's access to credit. There are many, many, many financial institutions and reputable banks all over developing countries that literally will not give credit to women unless they arrive with a land title or their husband's permission to provide a land title. So this is a huge barrier, even in countries where women's land rights are constitutionally protected. We do not see the banking and the finance sector getting on board with altering their lending practices yet. And of course, credit is needed. It might be needed for a woman to start a new business, but also for her to actually invest in her farm. So these are just some of the issues that I think we want to talk about today and drill down a little bit more on. And because I also am not as deep an expert in all these issues, I'm happy now to turn it over to some of our other speakers to provide some more data and insight into these topics. But just to say that, ICRW remains really committed to this research. We've been doing it for a long time, and particularly on the issue of land rights. We really feel that this is an area that is just desperate for more research, more documentation that could help to fuel more policy change and better programming. So thank you.
Great, Catherine. Thank you so very much. So we'll take a few questions, and Catherine will answer as best she can, or direct us
Yes.
to where we can find some answers if that's not the case. Anyone want to ask some questions of Catherine? Yes?
I'm Indira Sandelia from Partnership for Transparency Fund. We work on anti-corruption issues.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, how much of this insecure land rights involves corruption as well? Is it just a cultural thing, or is it something to do with the government policies? Does corruption play a certain role in this?
I don't actually have a good answer for that, but I'm sure other people in the room probably have some more experience with understanding that. Land titling itself, irrespective of gender, I know can be problematic, and in terms of, yes, who gets access to the systems. But I'm sure maybe others on the panel have some more data on that.
I can weigh in.
Okay, sure, why not?
I'll let you
Please.
go.
No, go ahead.
I would say the large extent of these inequalities really are coming from sort of the embedded customary norms that exist in these communities, but also at the government policy framework side also. I mean, as you're mentioning, essentially family laws and certain kind of frameworks that just by default set up an arrangement where you give the title to the head of household, who, according to the definitions, is almost always the man in the household. Things like that lead to this structural kind of inequality. I don't get the sense from my read of the evidence in Africa that corruption per se is driving it. It's a lot of the sort of, not only the customary norms not providing sort of the sufficient protections to women, but also on the formal legal frameworks. Oftentimes they fail to really provide women with equal sort of access to these productive resources. But that's my sense.
Access to seeds and fertilizer. Is there any signs of corruption there? Because we've heard in some of the countries, women, especially the female farmers, have problems getting access to seeds and fertilizers. So I just wondered if in your work you have come across something like that.
Certainly, seed quality and fertilizer quality are serious problems in many of the countries where we work, where we've heard many anecdotes of poor quality seeds, spoiled seeds, fake fertilizer, and that is regardless of whether a male or female farmer. But of course, the barriers that face female farmers make them even more vulnerable. For example, lack of literacy or lack of access to extension services so that they can make the right decisions on seed quality. And also some of the structural issues such as the seed certification system. We found in many countries women are the primary informal seed vendors, but they're not necessarily absorbed into the formal seed sector, so they don't have access to labs or other certification methods. So I agree, it's all over.
Thank you.
Let's take 2 additional questions and I will answer them both at once. There was someone over here that had their hand up.
No, it's okay. I'll just wait towards the end.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, Catherine. I'm Roberta Loretta Bernhard from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and you mentioned that more research was needed for this issue, women owning land title, and tenure. Are you all doing anything right now specifically in that research area, or can you point us to some others who are, or?
Sure. I mean, we are doing another project right now in Vietnam, actually, looking at women's both land titling and also informal household level decision making in which women participate around how to use land, for example. So it's not, I think that the titling is one issue, but then the other issue is around what power women have actually within their relationships to influence what's being grown or what's being sold, what's being kept for household consumption. So there's, of course, Landesa does a tremendous amount of work around land rights, some of which is related to gender. Yeah, there's just, we'd be happy to speak, I'd be happy to speak more about any other data we have that might be useful for you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Beth Rocco with Bread for the World. I'm curious with some of your research if you've been able to identify some best practices on land tenure and how to actually increase women's ability to have a land title. And I saw a neat program in Tanzania that World Renew was doing about female mentorship, where one woman for land title would then, go and counsel others on how she went about to achieve it. But it was interesting because her husband was with her and really had to be very supportive in the process, and that was really kind of neat. But I also think he's a bit extraordinary in that regard.
Right. Yeah. We have done some research in collaboration with the Uganda Land Alliance, specifically on an intervention that we legal land rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, and also start to kind of thwart some of the more customary land tenure practices that require just the type of change agent action that you're talking about, getting leaders on board, and just raising this as a topic for communities that has to do with how the community thrives, how households thrive. I think as gender equality advocates, we're always trying to make the case that social and gender equality makes everyone more prosperous. So what does it mean for your farm to have equal decision-making power in the household, equal legal power to own the land, and how does all that build a more productive sort of community and households? So those are the types of messages that we've tried with the paralegals, and I think paralegals are one avenue for doing that. Certainly, it would seem to need community-based approaches in addition to legal ones.
And I would add also that it's such a complex situation. One of the women's groups that I visited in Mali was this women's seed multiplying cooperative, which great initiative. But we found that the members were working 3 plots of land: their own plot of land, their cooperative's land, and then their family plots. So you can just imagine. Of course, these women don't have time to go to the women's leadership training that we're always pushing on them. So you really have to take a holistic view of what our constituents are facing.
Yes, change your mind?
My name is Luis Corrales. I'm with Action Aid USA. We are following lots of cases all over the world where, because of the pressure to grow crops for renewable fuel standards, for ethanol a lot of small farmers in Indonesia, in Africa, in Central and South America have been forced out of their land. In many instances, through political force, through corruption, military, etc. Is there any information available in terms of how this has impacted specifically women farmers?
Yeah, that's another incredibly important issue. I don't know that we understand the connections very well. I mean, the issues around land grabbing they're getting a lot of great attention right now, and I think we definitely appreciate the attention that they are getting. But I don't off the top of my head know of any evidence or research that's being done to better understand how that has what role gender inequality might play in that, or how women are being affected by that particular practice.
Okay, great. Catherine, thank you so very much. I think that we've learned that there's certainly a lot of issues in terms of a gender productivity gap, areas that need to be better addressed, laws, policies, household power dynamics, but also that there are a number of areas where there needs to be a lot more research, where we're seeing growing patterns, but we don't really have the data and the information that we need to be able to talk about the extent of the problem and then begin to sort of look for solutions. So it sounds like part of what we might need to be doing as a community that's interested in these areas is really sort of promoting more research, and funding for research on these issues, so that we can come up with better solutions. Catherine, thank you so very much. Next, we're going to hear from Mike.
Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you very much for this gracious invitation to speak with you today. I appreciate you taking the time. My name is Michael O'Sullivan. I work at the World Bank's Gender Innovation Lab within the Africa region. We basically try to identify policies and programs that boost women's economic empowerment across Africa, primarily through impact evaluations and other sort of rigorous inferential research. So I'm going to start today, first off, by thanking Catherine for setting me up so nicely for this presentation, because a lot of the things that you addressed I'm also going to talk about, and I think it was a really nice framing. So I'll start with a few assumptions. First off, we all know in this room that there is this gender productivity gap. I'm going to be speaking about the continent of Africa and sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but this is something we observe throughout the world. So we know that this gap exists. I also sort of take it that everyone in this room is aware of the costs of this gap, that it's costly, and conversely there are opportunities, sort of payoffs to be gained from narrowing the gap. So I won't try to motivate too much here on what we're going to be talking about. And then third, hopefully I'll see the links with food security and nutrition. I'm not going to be speaking at length about that, but clearly it's an outcome that is embedded and linked with this question of productivity and yields of farmers in smallholder households throughout Africa. So I'm going to be speaking today about this report called Leveling the Field. I actually distributed the executive summary. This is the more in-depth version of the report. I only have a few copies today, unfortunately, but we have links we can send around for the full PDF on our website. So this is a report that we've done jointly with the World Bank, including the Agriculture Global Practice, the LSMS team, and my team, the Gender Innovation Lab, along with the ONE campaign, which many of you know is a sort of global policy advocacy group. So this report sort of tells us two new things that I'm hoping to share with you today. What's driving this gender productivity gap and what we can do to close it. So it's a sort of comprehensive evidence-based policy report that breaks new ground because it basically identifies the priority drivers of this productivity gap, but also what we can do to try to close it. So it marshals new data, new methods, and new policy guidance. Excellent, thank you. All right, so first I'll talk about the better data. So we have new data and what we would view as better data. This is rich, plot-level agricultural data from the World Bank's LSMS Integrated Surveys on Agriculture program. These data are from 6 countries that comprise more than 40% of sub-Saharan Africa's population. Now, previous efforts to document the gender productivity gap relied either on large-scale data sets that didn't yield much in terms of insights on gender. You couldn't quite tell within the household what was going on. You couldn't look at sort of gender questions around control and use and management. But also, we have some sources of really rich, deep, insightful data, but very small sample sizes. So some of the examples that you were citing earlier, Catherine, are basically the basis on which we're making these arguments for why it's a smart thing to do in terms of the economics of it. But these data are nationally representative data. They offer plot level information on control and use of these productive inputs. And you get to separate out sort of the male jointly managed plots, male managed plots, female managed plots. So next, the report also helps sort of help us understand the drivers of the gender gap. Now, we use a statistical method that's borrowed from labor economics known as Oaxaca blinder decomposition to sort of sort out what's really sort of driving this gap. So this is important for two reasons. First, it helps us isolate the relative importance of these factors for production and productivity. So a factor might be labor, it might be your access to agricultural extension, it might be the amount of fertilizer that you use. But just as importantly, the program also helps us identify differences in returns to those factors. So previous research indicated that men tended to use more inputs than women, and this explained the gender gap. So the resulting policy conclusion from this body of research is fairly straightforward. Equalize access to these productive inputs, and you can neutralize the gender gap. It turns out, and I'm being a little provocative here because I know that this was actually also mentioned earlier, that closing the gender gap in access is not enough to close this productivity gap. It's not just about getting more stuff in the hands of female farmers. It's also helping these female farmers make better use of the stuff that they have. So I'll give an example of fertilizer. If we take the example of fertilizer, even when men and women, for example, use the exact same amount of fertilizer, 1 kilogram of fertilizer, let's say applied, small amount, I admit, on a hectare of land, the results are not always equal. Men tend to enjoy higher yields from this same amount of fertilizer than women. So such a finding can have a profound impact on the design of policy because it's no longer just, again, about getting more stuff in women's hands. It's how do we help them make better use of the stuff that they have in addition to helping them on the productive resource side. Now, during the discussion, I hope maybe to talk a little bit more about this and what might be driving this gap in returns. It's a bit more of a nuanced story, and we're actually trying to uncover it ourselves, what's driving this. But let's move to what's happening sort of at the continent, sub-Saharan Africa-wide level. What are the facts behind this gap? First, how big is this gap? So when we look at a sort of simple comparison of averages across male and female controlled plots, we find that women produce up to 25% less per hectare than men. Now, again, we're talking about productivity, so output per hectare. Now, when you control for regional differences and the fact that women tend to farm smaller plots of land than men, one arrives at a much starker conclusion. Significant gender gaps range from 23% in Tanzania to a strikingly large 66% in Niger. This means that women in Niger produce on average 66% less per hectare than their male counterparts. So what's driving this gap across countries? So while each country's gender gap, of course, is unique, there are certain factors that have been cutting across all the contexts in which we've been looking. I should mention these are drawn on a bunch of detailed background reports produced by colleagues within our DEC, Development Economics Research Group, and the Gender Innovation Lab. So the first factor that comes out clearly across all the board in every country that we surveyed was farm labor. In every country that we surveyed, women use less male farm labor, particularly adult male household farm labor, and they get less out of each unit of labor or each person day of labor that they apply. Now, we also see that this farm labor gap starts in the home, given that female farmers tend to live in households with either due to migration, widowhood, or divorce, without as many male members in the household. We also observed that women's childcare duties also drag down returns across markets. So in 4 of the 6 countries that we surveyed, and this gets more into the sort of some of the norms around these institutions and norms issues that are also having an impact on productivity. In 4 of the 6 countries we surveyed, having more children relative to adults in the household drags down women's returns. We also find that fertilizer in every country that we surveyed matters either for quantities in terms of how much fertilizer you apply, or returns, that is what you get out of what the quantities that you apply. So these, for us, are sort of the 3 key issues, in addition to, and I should mention this is another assumption at the outset, this is after women have already acquired or had access to land. So land is this kind of thing that doesn't fit so neatly within this framework, but we actually argue is just as important, if not more critical, for the discussion. So how do we level the field? After sifting through some rigorous evidence, the available evidence from impact evaluations and other credible research, we try to identify a 10-point policy action plan. So we try to distinguish between promising policies for which we actually have some rigorous impact evaluation evidence and emerging new ideas that are worthy of further piloting and testing. So I'm going to offer you 4 concrete examples of some of the policy approaches that we've put forth. Now, this evidence base is actually what's really encouraging is that it's growing really quickly. You're seeing studies across the globe that are yielding new insights into these questions. But it's still currently pretty thin evidence base in the sense that we have studies, really rich, detailed studies going back a few decades, and then more recent experimental work from which we can draw. So I'll start with start with an option that I think is just sort of in the incipient stages of being designed even within the context of some World Bank programs, which is to offer some financing to female smallholder for mobilizing extra farm labor. So women, of course, as I mentioned earlier, face this constraint in terms of availability of farm labor that's holding back their yields. They're also getting less per hectare from the farm labor that they use. Now, impact evaluation evidence from Zambia has shown that simple cash transfer programs can boost a household spending on hired farm labor and other inputs. So another approach that may work in the context of specifically targeting female farmers is trying to provide these kinds of transfers to help them mobilize extra labor, perhaps during the peak labor times when they really need extra support on their farms. We should also try to provide rural community child care centers and test and evaluate these approaches to see whether they also help free up women's time for more agricultural work, as well as to benefit Africa's youngest generation. So Sebastian Martinez and co-authors, Sebastian is currently at the IADB, conducted a randomized control trial of a preschool program in rural Mozambique and found that in addition to having beneficial impacts on the school children who were participating in this preschool program, it also actually boosted the labor force participation of primary caregivers by 26%. So freeing up that time may also be of value for female farmers who may not have as much time to devote to their agricultural tasks. And now this gets more to also this question of inauthentic seed and fertilizer. One approach would be to partner with the private sector to pilot and test the certification of smaller, affordable bags of fertilizer. Now, why might this bite more for female farmers? Well, we know from the evidence that females, on average, farm smaller plots of land than men. That, by sort of logic, you would hazard a guess that then there would be less likely to purchase the sort of massive 50 kg bags of these inputs that we would assume would be more likely to be certified and trustworthy. So this, again, this is something for which we're still conducting some more qualitative research and trying to look into the feasibility of this within our own impact evaluations. But we think it's definitely an idea worth trying, because getting women access not only to fertilizer but certified quality fertilizer might also help in terms of narrowing these gaps that we see. And finally, boosting women's tenure security and men's tenure security is essential for boosting agricultural productivity. So we have evidence from solid impact evaluations shows that promising policies such as joint certification or joint land titling can really yield positive impacts. So one example comes from work that our colleagues in the Gender Innovation Lab are doing with colleagues in the DEC land group at the World Bank, looking at an impact evaluation, so looking at a land tenure regularization program in Rwanda. So the government of Rwanda has embarked on this impressive effort to systematically register every parcel of land in essentially one of Africa's most densely populated countries. During the pilot, our team actually did the first round of an impact evaluation. They're actually doing another sort of looking at the rollout of this program. But during the pilot, they found some impressive findings. So they found that the program led to an increase in investment in land by males, particularly male-headed households, by 10 percentage points. But the program actually led to an increase of 19 percentage points among females. Now, I should mention that the program is innovative not just because it's low-cost participatory approach, but also because it mandated that married female spouses also be on the document. So this finding that you see an almost twice as large impact on female farmers suggests that, to us, it suggests three things. First off, women face higher degree of tenure insecurity to start with. Second, that when you address this tenure insecurity, you can lead to payouts not just for this household, but for the economy at large. And third, as a number of the sort of examples in this report demonstrate, there are a lot of these policies that are kind of win-win options for policymakers. It's not a zero-sum game. It can actually lead to tangible benefits of increased equality for both the male and the females within these households. So I'll just leave it at that, and thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you so very much, Michael. This is some really interesting results. I know there are lots of questions about some of your findings. Who'd like to go first? Yes.
Hi, I'm Bethany Brown with HelpAge USA. We work with older people in 65 low and income countries. So the work that we've done around land rights has mostly been around older women's access to secure land tenure, and a lot of that has been linked to the elimination of violence against those older women who are at risk because their land is insecure. And it sort of echoes back to some of the other things that we've been talking about in our approaches around paralegal support, community training, sort of wraparound work along with national level advocacy. I'm curious about the plot that showed what factors are at play with the research that you're doing. I saw that age was on there, and I was wondering sort of how that plays out as a factor for this work on leveling the field.
So with respect to age and its influence on productivity, we see it in particular in northern Nigeria, I think also in Niger. So in certain contexts, defining who a female farmer, of course, for the purposes of this data analysis, we had to be somewhat rigid in our definition. We had to sort of define who is the principal decision maker on this plot, on this parcel. In some contexts, that doesn't actually neatly align with the head of household, meaning that you have, in Uganda, for example, there are a lot of women who live in male-headed households who also are farmers in that sense. Now, we all know that, as was mentioned earlier, women are very much present throughout the whole agricultural production process. So just want to mention that before then I jump into the results. With respect to age, we actually see that there's kind of a penalty for being older, essentially, in terms of productivity. Now, what does that mean? Could that be, there's the accumulation of human capital over time that may also have sort of an effect on your ability to use all the factors that you have. But we did see in our data that those women in particular weren't getting access to some of the key inputs that you need. Now, I don't know, I can't speak beyond that, but it was something that was coming out in the data, in particular in northern Nigeria. And I'm happy to sort of look into that and speak with the colleagues who did that background paper to find out more. But yeah, it's an issue in particular. So on average, female-headed households tend to be headed by women who are older on average than the women who live in male-headed households, typically because of the circumstances in which they've arrived at being a head of the household. And then finally, I would mention just sort of around these issues of land tenure and widowhood, there's also a lot of work to be done also in the sort of higher level policy framework side to figure out a way in which sort of the customary norms, which usually dictate that the land would either go to the son of that person, that woman, or if she has no siblings, it might be taken back by the brothers of the deceased. Trying to figure out ways in which women can actually maintain that land is critical.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Beatrice Mohin. I work with Mason Solutions, and we have done work in agriculture and nutrition in Zambia, Cameroon, and Uganda.
Sorry, could you speak up just a little bit?
Yeah, I said my name was Beatrice. I work with Mason Solutions, and we have worked with women in Zambia, Uganda, and Cameroon. And what came from Catherine's presentation and yours, I am seeing kind of a dichotomy between women farmer and men and smallholder farmers. And I was just wondering, is there any research that has tried to figure out, because I know that even though a family can be a woman-headed household, there are men in that family. Is there any research that has looked at investment by a household that can address the labor-intensive impact on a woman when they are in the farm by themselves, mechanization, access to credit, where we are not looking at them isolatedly as women and then looking at men? Are there any options in the future that can be looking at a case where, because in practical sense, I grew up in Africa and the cash crops was the labor and the cash crops was basically carried by women if it was not mechanized.
So I'll hazard a guess the reply here. So there's definitely, I mean, obviously there's lots of work at the household level and looking at aggregate production of household and trying to disentangle sort of relative contributions of men and women. What we're trying to do here then now is to look sort of with looking at a lower level of aggregation and looking at decision makers of parcels and plots. But there also have been sort of, I'd say, much more carefully designed studies that have also been done. So for instance, the Burkina Faso study that was mentioned earlier, where there's a comparison of male and female managed plots within the same household, growing the same crop, which is kind of, it gives you maybe a tighter comparison in terms of input use and what yields they're getting, because they're facing more or less the same external circumstances with respect to weather, etc. So there are examples of those types of studies, but I think we're wrapping our heads around this question of how do we move beyond even, obviously moving beyond headship as a female-headed, male-headed comparison, but also how do we more kind of in a more granular fashion define the relative contribution of men and women. So we're trying, for example, to try to measure labor inputs at the farm plot level, because you see that men are obviously using a lot of their spouse's labor on their plots. So we might ascribe this to being the man's production, but it's really a joint family contribution that is a bit more difficult to disentangle. But these norms actually then, the findings from the Burkina Faso study, for example, from Chris Udry in 1994/96, suggest that this practice whereby men will, let's say, have their spouses working on their plots first before they attend to their own, might have actually sort of penalties for the household's aggregate production, and might lead to inefficiencies. And so by taking some of that excess labor that they're using on the man's plots and reallocating it to the spouse's plots, you can lead to what's viewed in economic terms as sort of a Pareto improvement. Everybody's better off. So I guess that's my convoluted way of answering that. There has been some work done, and we're trying to do more and trying to get at a better picture of, beyond just headship and plot manager, what is the respective contribution of women and men to each of these production functions.
So what I'd like to do, there are a lot of hands up. If you can raise your questions really quickly, we'll hear all of your questions, and then we'll see how many you can respond to. So really quickly with the question. Yes.
I would like to go back to your last point and to Sylvia's. I worked for many years in Mali in agriculture, and do I know that the women don't have time to come to anything because of the plots, 1, 2, 3, the personal, the family, and so on. However, of what plot do they have control over the resources? When they make local millet beer, they buy the millet at the market. They don't take it off the family granary. And therefore, Michael, what you suggest, allocating some of that female labor to her own field, that's not a feasible option, because the woman is obliged to do her share on the family field, although she doesn't have any advantage of that labor. Therefore, I would think that maybe we should not so much focus on women in agriculture, but we should rather focus on those resources where she gets the money from and where she controls the money. Her manufacturing of millet beer, of bean cake, of sumbala, or whatever product from which she has the money and she is allowed to spend it as she wants.
Okay, thank you. Question on this side?
Yes, I'm Whitney Trevese with Souptel Mobile Solutions, and I had a question actually about a finding related to tailoring agriculture extension services, really targeting female farmers, and I'm curious just to hear a little bit more about that and how that might work, particularly engaging social networks was mentioned and mobile technology.
Can I just add on, because mine was really almost the same as hers. I'm Krista Ridley, formerly with Oxfam, and in between gigs at the moment. I lived in Burkina and Niger. And I was wondering, in terms of some of the solutions that you have, what role does extension play? And then secondly, I'm sure we've learned a lot about extension over the years since I was living in Africa. And my question is, have we learned that it doesn't necessarily have to be a woman who's the extension agent, but it can be a respected man in the community who can work with women and improve some of these situations?
Okay. Yes.
Okay, Lori Timmerman, Rural Development Specialist. And I just wanted to note that there's one policy option of identify female volunteer farm advisors. It's like, why can't these women be paid?
Sure.
That to link that with a model that I was aware with when I was working with IDE called agro dealers, and embedding the input supply in the local retail sector. So you have barefoot bankers or barefoot agro dealers, and having projects that support women to be in that space.
Great. Not to overload you, I'll take two more questions. Gentleman in the back.
Stephen Wong from Counterpart International. I was just wondering with the rural childcare, if you're seeing increased gaps between the haves and have-nots, because when you save time, you have more money, but if you don't have the initial money, then you can't access the childcare.
Grace?
My name is Grace. My question is in regard to the gender disparities in productivity related to fertilizer use. It's quite intriguing. I know that one explanation that came out is the low availability of labor. And I was wondering what other factors can account for the fact that men and women can use the same quantity of fertilizers, and then their use are still not equal.
Okay, great. Thanks, Grace. And I'm going to use my privilege and also ask a question, which is kind of similar. My question is, I'm really intrigued with this issue that women use less farm labor, especially male labor from the household. And I'm wondering how, deep the research has looked into that, in terms of then what are, what are some of the causes? Is there like power dynamics in the household that then, male adolescents, may not want to work on their mother's farm as opposed to their father's farm, or, what's going on there. And then also in terms of, is the research sort of suggesting that male labor is a lot better in terms of more productive than female labor? And is that like, labor from the household or labor outside of the household? I mean, I'm just interested to get a sense of, what are some of the, digging a little deeper into those findings. And you have to answer all of that in 5 minutes.
Another question.
I want to add to
Glad I came today.
that way we have less time for my presentation. So in following Pat's question, how does that particular finding square with the evidence in many countries where women make up a big part of the ag productive labor force, where a lot of women, as their secondary livelihood, hire themselves out?
Okay, so I'll start with the labor question and try to work backwards, I guess. So we, one of the nice things about these data sets is they tried to record as best as possible the sort of relative input contributions when it comes to labor, farm labor. So there are a few factors at play, and I should mention that whenever I'm talking about these results, they're done within a sort of multivariate regression framework. So you're trying as best you can to control for certain factors. But obviously there are things that you can't account for because you're using sort of cross-sectional, non-experimental data. So sort of structurally, in terms of the quantity of farm labor, as I mentioned earlier, just the structure of the households in which female farmers tend to live, they tend to have fewer people, and they tend to have fewer adults in particular, whom they can use to sort of help out on the farms. So there's that issue, but there's also this gap in the return. So they're getting less out of the labor that they're using. So this could be, and this is something again that we're trying to disentangle with more qualitative research and such. It could be a supervision question. So there might be sort of norms around men or women being less willing to follow the instructions of a female farmer who's hiring them versus a male farmer. Sort of these norms, these issues that are coming up that might be driving these results, but we can't say with certainty that that's the case. Now, they, as you know, as you mentioned, and as we've been discussing, women do make up a huge share of the agricultural labor force in Africa. Now, when it comes to who's more productive, on average, we've seen that once you account for these differences in inputs and such, once you account for all the other factors that are going on, women and men are essentially just as productive. So it gets back to this access to the resources and trying to deal with these gaps in returns question. But I'll try to sort of more deeply answer your question, I guess, one-on-one. So fertilizer returns question. So this one, your question would launch me into a whole long story about what could be driving it. That, again, is something that it's a broad area of research for this, for example, with the fertilizer question. So one hypothesis is that it's just cash, so that women are not able to afford the good quality fertilizer, and they're using the same fertilizer, but we don't observe the differences in quality. It could be that there's a cash constraint that's with a time dimension. So maybe women are getting their cash at the wrong periods, in a sense, and they can't really use the cash during the planting season when you really need it. So the policy responses here would be different. The policy response there would be to try to come up with sort of time-limited discounts that really help, that come when that constraint is really binding. Another possibility, as I hinted at earlier, is the quality of the fertilizer differing along gender dimensions, just because women tend to farm smaller plots of land, and they're not able to maybe they're accessing poorer quality, diluted, adulterated fertilizer. But these are all hypotheses that we want to test and figure out.
Plus, fertilizer subsidies are politically seated.
Absolutely, and acquisition of these may be mediated through your group membership or other channels that might be. Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering whether it also be the fact that women generally have more marginal lands, so that quantity for quantity, if your land was much more marginal, then the output would not match.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering.
Yeah. No, that's for us another area of research, because we've actually tried and have, this might sound surprising, but we've spent a lot of time trying to find good, solid, hard evidence on soil quality differences by gender, and there aren't that many studies that do it in a really solid, rigorous way. So there's some evidence in Uganda. There's Chris Udry's paper in Burkina. There are a few papers where you see, for example, in Ghana, my boss Marcus Goldstein did a paper where they found soil quality, organic matter differences between male and female farmers in terms of the soil differences. But they didn't find that difference led to any difference in productivity. So there's still this open question. I think that my hunch would be that you're right, but actually it's still also something that we're trying to get better evidence. But it turns out, soil quality tests are rather expensive. So, to do it properly. So on the rural childcare point, you're absolutely right. I mean, capital and cash constraints would be one factor. I believe the example that I mentioned in rural Mozambique was a subsidized childcare provision program. We're working with a World Bank project in DRC to test different arrangements of childcare. So we're actually going to try more of a cooperative group labor kind of model where family members rotate and share labor, versus a more formal structured model where they have sort of, the whole trained instructors and accredited, et cetera, to see sort of if the low cost versus, deluxe model approach really matters. And both of them will actually be also messing around a little bit, because experimental people love to do this, with the fee structures and to see to what extent really cash constraints bind.
But what about quality early childhood development?
Sure. No, I mean, ECD is huge. Absolutely. I fully agree. No, so I'm looking at it obviously from the boosting productivity side, but there's a whole slew of positive benefits for the children who get access to these things. Now, my prior would be maybe on the more expensive one, you might get better quality instruction and care. But at the same time, yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned that earlier. That was an aside from that. The paper from Sebastian Martinez that I mentioned earlier, that's the core point of their paper is, look, it's great for kids, but here it's also good for women and men. So, So on the volunteer farm advisors, input suppliers, this is another pathway that, you know, if I had hours to talk, I think I would try to mention that. You're absolutely right that trying to work through these suppliers might be a channel. This also, though, might be a channel of sort of, might be a way that driver of the inequality. If men in certain networks have access to these suppliers, and through their networks, because men on average tend to have larger social networks, they on average tend to have more of these connections with these types of actors. So so trying to foster those links between agro-dealer, agro-suppliers, and sort of advisors is important. Now, the volunteer farm advisor point, they just happened to do this with this experiment, and that's where we had the evidence that it actually mattered. In DRC, we're working with some researchers at the Paris School of Economics, where they just set up a quota. So the program is providing high-yield seeds, made seeds. And the program actually mandates that at least half of the participants on the demonstration plots have to be female. And the initial results from that are in those villages where they randomly varied this and they sort of allowed for that, you actually see a higher increase in adoption of these improved seeds. So is it that women are really the ones making these decisions? Or we're not sure, we're trying to figure out the mechanisms, but in that case as well, these were women who weren't being paid. Now, I think it would be great if you have the resources and are able to pay these people to provide them with a livelihood, absolutely. I'm just trying to think about when you're, you know, faced with constraints in terms of resources. It seems that even being a trainer might also actually be beneficial to you as a farmer, because you're developing and acquiring skills. So it's not sort of a pure exploitative kind of relationship, but trying to figure out sort of models of delivery. We put forth some ideas. We think that it could possibly also be knowledge. If you look on average, adult female farmers tend to have less education than their male counterparts. So remedial education, adult education is also another thing that could sort of interact well with extension to sort of lead to that multiplier effect we're looking for.
The results of your study and all of the questions that have come up tells us two things. One is we need more data, but we absolutely need better data, right? So it's not just that we need to collect the same information that we've been collecting, but we need to collect different information. We need to go a lot deeper, not only, you know, gender disaggregated data, but actually looking at some very specific issues and patterns as well. So thank you so much for that. Sylvia, over to you.
Great. To continue the discussion of extension, I feel like the female extension agent is like the golden unicorn of gender and ag, because there are very few and rarely seen. And we often don't talk about the recruitment and retention aspect, which is, you know, how do you even make work as an extension agent attractive to a college-educated young woman who probably grew up in a town or in a city. She probably has a spouse who's in the capital. She probably doesn't know how to ride a motorcycle. She probably has kids. So it's just a very difficult sell. So, you know, that's always the number one recommendation is more women extension agents, and yet we don't think about the pipeline.
Right.
So now onto my...
But the e-extension stuff is interesting because you can break down this, you
Exactly.
can have that direct connection maybe with farmers, but yeah, that's something that we're trying to do.
So now to my PowerPointless presentation. My name is Sylvia Kappes. I'm one of the 3 gender advisors in the Bureau of Food Security at USAID. I like to say that we work with farmers and their husbands. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about what we're doing in order to actually use what my colleagues have talked about, this large and growing evidence base of gender issues in ag. First by talking about our famous Women's Empowerment in Ag Index, which I know many of you are familiar with, and then talking about some of the bigger emerging issues that we're also grappling with, and I certainly look forward to hearing what our partners are doing in this respect. So we've talked a lot about the gender gaps, and we found in the Bureau of Food Security that although we know what the gender gaps are, we have a good sense of what they are, even if we don't have the numbers to back them up. What do we do about them? And so one of the responses is that we developed the Women's Empowerment in Ag Index, the WEA, 3 years ago. So this was the data collection analysis taking place in all 19 Feed the Future countries, and we're actually now trying to see what we could do with the results. We find this really important because even after 20 plus years of talking about gender issues in ag, we still find that in the project design process, especially with our friends in ag and food security, that a lot of our interventions are designed to be gender neutral, despite the 43% number from FAO, and certainly anytime you go into a village in sub-Saharan Africa or anywhere, you know who's doing the work. And we also wanted to find out what really are the linkages between women's bargaining power and children's nutritional status. As many of you know, Feed the Future is innovative for its linkages between ag, food security, nutrition, and gender. And we know that women are traditionally stewards of the health and nutritional status on the household level, but how does that affect decision making, and how does that, in the end, impact the numbers on stunting and malnutrition? So the index is based on a survey, and it measures men's and women's empowerment and inclusion in the ag sector. To refer to Beatrice's point, we interview men and women in the same household with the same questions. And we have our survey organized to investigate 5 domains of empowerment. Decisions about ag protection, access to and decision-making power over productive resources, control over use of income, leadership in the community, and time use. And we also have a component that measures relative empowerment within the household. So women's empowerment is a portion of men's. I'm not an M&E expert, but I'm happy to refer you to my colleagues who are. And I'd like to really talk about how we're using this information. Bangladesh is the USAID mission in Bangladesh is the Feed the Future country that has really taken this information and run with it. They were one of the first countries, they were actually a pilot country, and then one of the first countries to undertake the WIA baseline study. And with the results, the mission really decided to take these findings to heart. They went ahead and retrofitted existing programs, and as many of you know, as implementing AID partners, that's very challenging to do with our friends in agreements and contracts. They encouraged the partners to take up activities focusing on promoting women's empowerment. They came out with a $6 million procurement for new programs, specifically on the WIA, especially on activities to promote women's empowerment in the 5 domains. And the mission is also working with our friends at IFPRI with the Ministry of Ag in Bangladesh to help the ministry use the WIA methodology and findings. So that's all very exciting. So now what are we doing 3 years afterwards? In addition to working with the missions, we've also developed what we call the Gender Integration Framework. And we see that as a tool that's kind of an intermediary between the WIA study and results and the actual project design, because we found that it's not really easy to translate one to the other directly. So it's a way for missions and our partners to think about and prioritize the WIA findings, especially in terms of how the findings indicate what domain is the weakest and how do you program to improve the results in that domain. It's also a way for missions and partners to identify what kind of activities we're already doing that address those weaknesses, or what kind of activities we could be doing, promising practices that we see elsewhere but we're not doing ourselves. And so we're embarking on a number of trainings with our missions, and we plan to extend this to our partners as well, to make sure that we really use this data to the best way possible. We're also developing or finalizing a core WIA, which is a lighter and more streamlined version. If you've actually seen the WIA survey, it's like a phone book. And you can imagine, you're an enumerator in the countryside somewhere trying to do this in the local language. So we're trying to make it more user-friendly. We're also developing some project-specific modules that missions and partners can add or subtract. And we're also trying to compile all of the good practices that we've seen using either the WIA survey or the WIA data. And lastly, we're creating a community of practice. So if you're interested in participating in that, please let us know. And I'd like to spend the last couple of minutes talking about kind of a laundry list of emerging issues that we're grappling with. How do we integrate cross-cutting issues? We're told to do gender integration, and yet we also have a number of other priorities that we also have to include. And I think that's reflected in the move toward not only talking about gender, but gender and social inclusion. First up is resilience. As many of you know, it's an agency priority. And we're lucky to be building upon more than 20 years of humanitarian work in emergency response. What's the best way for us to make sure that gender issues are addressed? Recently, I was in Burkina Faso in February, and we found that one of the key coping mechanisms was early marriage, because not only do you get rid of someone in your household that you have to feed, but you also have the asset boost because you're getting a couple of head of cattle in exchange for your daughter. So how do we program against that? Every coping mechanism that we've identified has some sort of gendered aspect. For another example is that when there's some sort of shock like a drought, the first response is to sell what assets you can, and oftentimes those are the women's assets. Anything from jewelry and kitchen utensils to small ruminants and poultry. So how do we reinforce that coping mechanism that's to women's detriment, or how do we compensate for that? We've had a long history of distributing assets as well as cash transfers. So that's a real challenge. How do we incorporate LGBT issues? Again, another priority for the agency. We work in countries like Uganda, and we don't want to jeopardize our constituents. And it's an additional challenge for us because the policy environment in Uganda is, you can even say, dangerous. And also LGBT issues are often perceived as an urban phenomenon. So how do we work with that population? Gender-based violence, another agency priority. We know that it has a very important economic impact, but how do we deal with that? FAO has come out with a guide for extension agents on how to deal with gender-based violence, but again, we're asking our extension agents to do everything under the sun. We have one project in Tanzania where gender-based violence is part of the farmer field schools curriculum, but again, that's not something that we could easily transfer to every context. Youth, our work is very conscious of the demographic dividend. How do we include youth, since every top 40 song says youth is our future. One of my favorite examples is a Feed the Future project in Mali, where we are training out-of-school adolescents, both young men and young women, in growing Feed the Future value chains. So that's the kind of promising practice that we like to replicate. Disability, which is, I consider, the last frontier in development. The most marginalized and the poorest part of society, and the most invisible. How do you work with the disabled, people with disabilities, when ag work assumes a certain level of physical capacity? Climate change. We love beans for their nutritional values, complete protein with rice, and yet I am in the anti-bean camp because it takes certain varieties, including the varieties that we promote, takes more water and longer cooking time. And we can address that with improved cooking stoves, but that has serious climate change implications because who goes out and fetches the water and the firewood? And because it's primarily women and girls, there's also a safety and security aspect to that. So we really need to think more thoroughly about the implications of supporting certain value chains. Constructive male engagement. We have seen the shift from women in development to gender in development, and we're in the business of changing social norms, and we can't do that without involving men and boys. But again, it's the how that's super, super challenging. One promising practice that we've seen is École de Marie husband schools that were piloted by UNFPA in Mali, and we're now replicating that activity in Niger and Burkina under our resilience programming. So we're hoping that that will really have some concrete results. And then lastly, Feed the Future is innovative because we're working on the nutrition side. Well, what about other subsectors in health? Probably the biggest one that's kind of the other side of the equation is family planning. We talk so much about increasing populations, pressure on land, not enough food, but we don't talk about the flip side, which is how do we help our constituents decide their family size. Thanks very much.
Great. Sylvia, thank you so much. We are almost out of time, but why don't we take 3 or 4 questions and then you can answer them all at once. How's that?
Thanks, Sylvia. I have a question about integration. One of the things Feed the Future has not only integrated ag and nutrition, but has been encouraging its partners to do a more fully integrated model with health and education and other things. And I guess my question is, how is that coming? Because it seems so important for nutrition, for gender, to have childcare, to have all those things come together for women. What kinds of obstacles have missions been running into in terms of that kind of integrated programming in Feed the Future?
Yes.
Should we take? Yeah. Okay, so first question is about integration. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Brian Greenberg with Interaction, and I wanted to thank the panel and congratulate you all for being in the most important area in development and therefore eligible for the annual Coonrod Award, important area of development. But more seriously, what I'm struck by is that a lot of the discussion and a lot of our interventions seem to be focused. I mean, we would all probably agree that it's important to get to root causes of gender disparities, but a lot of things we tackle seem more intermediate outcomes of it, symptoms of it, effects of it, negative consequences, and we attempt to mitigate that a little bit. Whether it's women getting the worst soil, less access to extension and fertilizer, or any of the things you'd care to name. And Sylvia, it was dizzying and daunting to hear you run through the crosscuts. My sympathies for having to bundle all that together. But I was particularly struck by your last observation that we have moved out of the women in development era into the gendered, relational, men included era of development. I would love to believe that's the case. I'm not sure we're there yet, and the demographics in this room suggest we've got a ways to go. And I wonder, without in any sense meaning to disparage our most prevalent tools of economics and agronomy, to get a handle on the disparities and the inequities, whether we don't also need a really strong culturally based social science cut into this. And it is possible to program that, but until we get at the prerogatives that men enjoy and the disadvantages that women face in negotiation and navigating the power differential between men and women, we're always going to be giving aspirin for symptoms. So my question for you really is, and I'm sorry to extend it like this, do you see a shift towards if you will, a cultural social science of cultural change being added on into this kind of an effort to change those fundamental premises around what men and women are together?
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lynn Brown. And because you brought up some of the bigger picture issues, Sylvia, and because of the last question, and I want to take this up to the very highest level and sort of say, the way I look at it is agriculture is now fundamentally unbalanced as a sector. And why do I say that? Well, because if you go back to the 1970 food crisis, the response was the Green Revolution, which is great. We needed the Green Revolution. But the response to the 2007-2008 price crisis increased the yields of staple grains. response to climate change, drought tolerant, salinity tolerant, water tolerant staples. So what's happened to all of this is staple grains are relatively cheap compared to what they were in 1970. Fruits, vegetables, livestock, fish, all of those products have become more expensive. And if you actually think about the agricultural system and who is more likely to grow different things, women are actually much more likely to be growing the high value, nutritious foods than they are to be growing the staple grains. So not only does the unbalancing actually make agriculture less profitable, it also is biased against women, and it biases it against a nutritious outcome. So I mean, we talk about nutrition sensitive agriculture, but the reality is agriculture should deliver an affordable, accessible, nutritious diet for everyone. And it actually doesn't do that. It delivers calories now, globally, doesn't produce enough fruits and vegetables for the whole world to actually consume what they should. And that unbalancing has cost women dearly because they don't get the technology. And I think it raises the question, I mean, USAID supports the CGIAR and is a big gender advocate within the CGIAR, but it's not doing the top level of how do we reframe agriculture. And similarly with the World Bank, it will talk about gender in the CGIAR, but it's not restructuring what is agriculture really looking at and what is it going at.
Final question? Elise.
I was listening at quite hard to this discussion, and some years back when Winrock International was looking at agriculture and gender issues and women, one of the things we found in all of that work, and to this day I'm sure it's true other places, that what the women at the grassroots received, the women farmers, was often not transmitted from them to the other people in their community, so that the ability to expand extension across a whole series of farmers in a region and trying to invest in girls and women who are the farmers, that is still a real challenge when you look at Africa today. So it's just putting it on the table that it's still there, but there's got to be some new ways to make the link between those women farmers and the ones that come in, and how is this information and technology that can help them pass further on so there's more impact. And that's just my challenging thought.
Thanks, Elise. Sylvia? You got integration, root causes, the imbalance in the sector, the technology and information not getting the women across.
So I get all the philosophical questions.
Yes.
Integration, how's that going? Gosh. I think we're doing a much better job now than 10 or 20 years ago, as you probably also realized. I think we have some structural challenges in the way USAID is organized and the way our budget flows and is accounted for and what we report on. A good example of that is child marriage, where child marriage is officially under global health, but it's also a youth and adolescent problem, so it falls under education, under E3. There's also livelihood and resilience issues, so it also concerns us in BFS. Well, whose money goes where, and then how do we take credit for it? It's an ongoing conundrum. And luckily, for something like child marriage, we do have an internal working group, and we coordinate as closely as we can. But those structural barriers still exist. But I think when we have a presidential initiative like Feed the Future, PEPFAR, and so on, that kind of goes above and beyond our organogram, that's when we have the most success. And you're right, we don't address the underlying social problems within a 5-year project time frame or less with the resources that we have. But I do feel that we provoke cultural change just in being there and working with our partners. When we tell people to wash their hands, and we tell people to plant their seeds in a row, we're affecting cultural change. And those cultures are going to change without us. I think it's great that we work with organizations like Promundo that address male privilege. I think it's great that we have staff and partners who recognize that it's not just women in STIR anymore. And I also am encouraged by the fact that in every single culture there's something, maybe you have to dig for it, there's something that promotes gender equality. In Morocco, our gender training was focused on verses from the Quran that focused on gender equality that no imam can challenge. So I think there's a lot of things that we're doing, but we're doing a lot, but we also have a lot of constraints. So right to your member of Congress. And the third question was about the greater global context of agriculture. When we decided on value chains, gender was one of the filters that we used in the choice of value chains, and that's why in many of our Feed the Future countries we focus on high value export oriented horticulture. So we do have that income and nutrition effect. And in parallel, we also work to make sure that women are involved at more points in the value chain, at higher points in the value chain, all the way up to marketing and commercialization. So I think that's one way that we're trying to address that, trying to encourage that fundamental change. We also are encouraged by crops like orange flesh sweet potato, where you have the gender aspect and the nutritional aspect, and our challenge is how do we scale that up so that we fully take advantage of the market aspect. And then the last question, I'm sorry for the, and to add to that, we also are working a lot on human capacity in agriculture. One of the projects that I manage is the award program, the African Women in Ag Research and Development Program, which trains and mentors MA and PhD candidates who are African women working in ag and related sciences. So it's not just the outcomes, but we're also trying to address the pipeline. And then the last question about linking women to farmers, if I understood that correctly. I think we have a lot of potential, and we've seen a lot of successes with ICTs. I think we need to really build upon our successes in education and literacy programs, and how do we bridge that with our ag extension and education initiatives. We've already talked about training the trainers and farmer initiatives and farmer field schools. In Mali, we try to promote a cascade effect where we make sure that half of our lead farmers and farmers field schools are women, and that part of the agreement to participate in the farmer field school is that they go back and train 10 more women. You see a greater availability of materials in local languages, and you see a greater consciousness with our partners in government about the need to access these rural communities. And I'm always encouraged by the example of Rwanda, although Rwanda is difficult to replicate, where, as far as I know, they're the only Ministry of Agriculture that has a gender strategy. And so any partner that's working in Rwanda has to adhere to that gender strategy. And Rwanda's current Minister of Agriculture is a woman, and the previous Minister of Agriculture is a woman. So again, there's that pipeline and recruitment and retention question as well. So, so how do we hit at all these different aspects? It's a challenge, but we're getting there.
Great, Sylvia, thank you so very much. And we want to thank all of the panelists today, Catherine, Michael, Sylvia. I think what we've learned is that we definitely need to have more research, we need more data. I think we've learned that access is important, right? It's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. I think from the audience, we've raised these broader questions about, what are the underlying, the real root causes, and how do we address those goes, and that some of that is, outside of the agriculture realm, but, within the household, within the culture, the whole social relations piece. On behalf of the Interaction Food Security and Agriculture Working Group, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We hope that this is not the end of the conversation, but the beginning of ways that, conversations where we can find ways that we can work together so that we can, get to some of these root causes and really begin to help to transform the lives of women and men around the world, and be sure that there's enough food for all of us, enough nutrition, so that we can then, be able to, take, that, strength and nourishment that comes from that, and really build a world that we can all be proud of and want to live in. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks again to Sylvia, Michael for that rapid fire response. We'll see you again soon.